Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second of our SQIP Virtual Salons. I'm really glad that you have all decided to join us tonight. It's going to be a great group of presentations. The title of tonight's presentation is Centering Critical Qualitative Inquiry, and Psychopolitical Validity, Reflections from Doctoral Candidates. So we've got a number of presenters tonight, and in just a few minutes, I'm going to bring up the event chair and organizer, Carla Rosinski. But before I do that, I just wanted to give everybody a quick kind of welcome and tour around this Crowdcast site, because I know not everybody has used this before. So as you can see, there's a chat box on the side, and I'm glad everybody has started using the chat window to chat with each other and say hello. And you can feel free to continue to use that throughout the presentation to share comments, thoughts, reactions, say hello to people you haven't seen in a while, just kind of a casual chat space. And if you'd like, as we're getting started and as I'm kind of chattering away up here, if you want, you can introduce yourself. You can put a little message in the chat window, say hello, who you are, and maybe what brings you to the event tonight. That way we can all get to know each other a little bit as well. So that's the chat window. As you can see down on the bottom of the screen, there's also an Ask a Question window. And that is a spot for you to put your questions that you want the presenters to address. The last bit of the event tonight is going to be some Q&A, some panel discussion with all the presenters. So if there's something you'd like them all to talk about or address, you can put it there. If there is a question that you have for a particular presenter, you can also go ahead and put it there. And I don't think the presenters will be taking questions during the presentation. I think we're going to do all the questions in a big group at the end. So let me just check with all of you. Can you hear and see me okay so far? Can you just put a little note in the chat if you're able to hear and see? Just want to make sure I'm coming through. Wait for someone. Yes. Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Nisha. And welcome. Good to see you. Also want to just point out one more little thing, which is that for those of you who are new to the Society for Qualitative Inquiry and Psychology, who maybe are not members or just finding out about the organization, we would love to welcome you to more of our events, more of what we do. There's a little button down at the bottom of the screen that says Join SQIP. If you click this button, you will not automatically become a member. It will just take you to our membership page, and you can learn a little bit more about SQIP and how to join the organization. So I think that's everything that I have to say. If anything comes up, if you're having technical difficulties, trouble hearing anybody, or anything else that you want to talk about, please feel free to put a little note in the chat. Oh, hi, Pei-Wei. And that way I'll see it and we can tech and troubleshoot. But now, without further ado, I'm going to bring to the screen our chair for tonight's presentation, Carla Rosinski. Take a minute to call Carla up.
Hi, I missed you saying that I was coming on screen, Elizabeth, but I was hearing everything you said prior to that. So I'm assuming I'm here now. I'm Carla Rosinski, and I am just going to give us a little bit of an intro for our presentation tonight. Thank you so much for having us. And we're excited to share a slice of our experiences and our development as critical scholars. The five of us are doctoral candidates at Lesley University in the Counseling Psych Division, and our program is entitled Transformative Leadership, Education, and Applied Research. And actually, Brandon will be officially Dr. Jones tomorrow. So congratulations to Brandon. And the rest of us are all at various stages of analysis, findings. We're all pretty much in the weeds with all that. I'll say a little bit more about how and why we came together as a group, but first I'm going to just read our objectives for today, and frame this presentation by briefly, defining what we mean by centering critical qualitative inquiry and psychopolitical validity. And then we'll each introduce ourselves individually and talk about our research, followed by some time for questions. Next slide, Elizabeth. And actually, next one, thank you. So our objectives today are to prioritize critical epistemology and methodologies in research for social change and collective liberation, to gain a foundational understanding of psychopolitical validity and promote ongoing engagement and critical reflexivity as vital to social justice practice, and to understand how we implemented this philosophy within our varied methodologies in order to advance our own reflection on practice and intersubjective perspective. Next slide, please. So critical researchers seek to illuminate power and deconstruct it, making the implicit explicit and bringing the unconscious into consciousness. Critical epistemology is our approach to looking at knowledge and what we think we know. We're critical because we know that all thought is mediated by power relations that are socially and historically constituted, and we're interrogating the dominant cultural norms and the status quo intentionally and illuminating the deceptions and assumptions that it carries. We're looking beyond the surface to ask questions such as who produced this information, what are their assumptions, what did they leave out and why, what are other meanings. We acknowledge that mainstream research that lacks a multi-level critical analysis can inadvertently reproduce the oppressive systems that it may seek to disrupt. And we also acknowledge that neutral means favoring of privileged groups. Next slide, please. So psychopolitical validity, the epistemic validity piece of it depends on the incorporation of knowledge of oppression on research and action by accounting for power dynamics that are operating at psychological and political levels in order to understand the phenomena of interest. And so in our writing and reflection, we consider questions like, is there an understanding of the impact of global political economic forces on the issue at hand? Is there an understanding of how these forces and social norms influence the perceptions and experiences of groups affected by these issues? And while epistemic validity refers to our understanding of psychopolitical dynamics of oppression, we also know that it's not enough to simply interpret the world or the systems of oppression. And so transformative validity demands changes in action towards liberation at personal, interpersonal, and structural domains. And the following questions attend to transformative validity, such as, do these interventions promote psychopolitical literacy? Do interventions empower people to take action and address political inequalities, social injustice within their relationship, settings, community, state, or international level? Does the work promote solidarity and strategic alliances and coalitions with groups facing similar issues? Next slide. We see ongoing critical reflexivity as vital to any social justice practice. Who are we and what motivates us? What experiences inform our thinking? In our commitment to collective liberation, how do we understand our various positions to oppression and power? How do systems of oppression, particularly white supremacy culture, show up in the classroom, in our interactions, in our relationships? And so we support each other with the ongoing interrogation of our thoughts, opinions, experiences, and ideas, and increasing insight and critical consciousness on a personal level and an interpersonal level, which we find necessary for a larger structural analysis. We help each other strengthen our positions and help find our blind spots. And so our doctoral program was created for clinicians who already have a master's level license. And so we all entered this doctoral journey with years of experience as clinicians and wanting to continue our own social justice practice. And we came together as a group as we began to identify each other as having shared values, working towards collective liberation and a commitment to expanding our own critical consciousness. We share the ideas that personal is political and professional. This is not an academic exercise. This is personal. Disrupting the status quo and dismantling systems of oppression in our research, in our teaching, and our clinical work must also occur in our personal life, in our thoughts, in our relationships with each other, and in part of everything we do. And so these ideas are infused into our work. And I'm going to pass it off to Serena, who will start us off on the individual presentations.
Next slide. Good evening, everyone. My name is Serena Cardozo, and I am a LMHC and also a PhD candidate at Lesley University. The title of my dissertation is The Pursuit of Housing, Chronically Homeless Men's Experiences Pursuing Affordable Housing. I'd like to start by just saying that I come to this work with a belief that homelessness is not only a social justice issue, but it is an experience that brings together all other kinds of social justice issues in our society. It's a visual representation of this country's history of oppressive systems. Next slide. As a Black woman from an immigrant family, I'm very familiar with the barriers in the system, and that intersection has informed the way that I view systems and work with clients, and that I've learned that systems don't fit. And it's being affirmed that excuse me, that the system does not work for everyone. I also have 8 years of experience in homeless services, providing direct services where I've helped clients navigate the challenges that come with obtaining housing, and holding management positions where I've sought to bring awareness and change barriers that prevent individuals from becoming housed. So therefore, my epistemological stance is critical. I believe that knowledge is acquired through lived experience, that marginalized groups have their own perspectives on how to change in order to be more equitable, and that these perspectives need to be at the forefront of systemic change. Next slide. So the definition of chronic homelessness is long-term or repeated incidences of homelessness coupled with a disability, and that can be mental or physical. And these individuals typically also have higher incidences of trauma, substance use, and neurocognitive issues. And they also are just African Americans are also disproportionately represented in this group. While housing is a human right, obtaining it can be really challenging, particularly for individuals who experience homelessness. And due to years of discriminatory federal housing practices and policies, the issue is often intensified for Black Americans, who again are disproportionately represented in the population. Much of the research on this topic, however, is quantitative or comes from the perspective of service providers and not the individuals that are experiencing it themselves. Therefore, the purpose of my study is to understand the lived experiences of chronically homeless individuals as they pursue housing, particularly the factors that enable them to persist. The theories that I employ to frame these issues are critical psychology, critical race theory, and risk and resilience theory. And the study, I recruited 9 men and I was intentional about wanting to recruit Black men so that I can understand also that layer of the perspective of Black men that are in this population. So I used purpose of sampling where I intentionally wanted individuals who met the criteria. It's a very specific criteria of chronic homelessness. For this study, I used semi-structured interviews with photo elicitation as well. Next slide. So I've gathered all my data and I'm in the analysis stages of my dissertation process. However, participants have overwhelmingly shared the challenges that they've experienced while they're pursuing housing, the coping strategies, and how they view themselves in relationship with this process, how they view their race or their gender in this process. And I'm still going through that data. However, in reflection of the research process, there have been several ways in which this process has both been liberating liberating not only for myself, but also infusing the values of liberation into my research. And so I really emphasized voice and choice in my study. It was really important to me because these voices are not heard, but they're the most impacted by the issue. So the participants in my study, for example, were given the choice of where they wanted to be interviewed. Some people chose their home. So those that had just been recently housed, that just chose their homes. Some chose to be interviewed outside, while others chose a coffee shop that was both accessible and welcoming to individuals experiencing homelessness. I used photo elicitation as well as a method of eliciting information from folks. This photo elicitation is a technique that's used with vulnerable populations often to help recall memory and past events. Photo elicitation is I took into context that these individuals have significant trauma and neurocognitive issues. And so in order to ease some of the emotional labor that goes into kind of recalling memories, I presented the participants with photos of things like housing applications, the shelters, things that were in their community that they could reflect on. And the another piece of this was also building trust with my participants. They knew, for example, that I had years and years, like I said, 8 years in homeless services, and also that I was a student. But for my participants, understanding that they may have negative experiences with service providers, which were systems that I was a part of, I thought it was really important that I disclose the places that I've worked, my intentions for doing that work, and also doing research on doing this type of research. And I acknowledge that there are challenges in the system, and that as a researcher, I hope to shed light on their experiences, both as a homeless service provider and make steps towards change with the research. Next slide. And in reflection, I feel like liberation is an ongoing process, but this was really liberating for me, in that I learned that, I challenged this notion that dissertation work or graduate school level research is isolating. Because as someone who thrives and is transformed by relationships, I knew that in order to sustain this work and to really do justice by my participants and remain accountable to them, that I needed to do this in relationship with others. And so I really took that relational approach when I met with my participants, again, making sure that they were comfortable and that they were choosing places that were giving them some power. Where do you want to meet? Do you have any questions for me? That building trust process. And also through my critical friends group, which is also the 5 presenters on here. The 5 of us on this panel came together through our shared commitment to become more critical scholars, understanding that that's like a lifelong journey. Our friendships within and between the group are ones of warmth, mutual respect, and trust, and therefore we're able to identify challenges. We're able to identify and challenge issues of power in our research, and also in our personal and professional lives. And that's been really transformative for me. I think that's been this group has probably been the most transformative piece for me in my doctoral experience. I'm also engaged in a writing group every week. And I just started, I started this group because I was like, I need some accountability partners. Like, I'm not going to get this done if I don't, I can't do this if I don't do this with people. However, it's become just a great and immense, source of support, accountability, feedback, and new perspectives, which, so for me, I think, so this quote at the top, it says, transformational change requires dialogical praxis, the relational activity involving the cycle of dialogue, learning, action, and reflection. Next slide. And so with all of this, I thought about this today, this quote that one of my participants said. Advice I would say is, once you know you have your place, shake it off, all the past and all the bad things that happened in the past, shake it off and prepare yourself for a new journey. And so while we are able to acknowledge the, and make changes within the research process that can be liberating for our participants, I think of all of the work that still needs to be done to dismantle systems of oppression and this other systems that they need to engage, that they will be engaging in once they're housed. So yeah, that's my presentation.
Thank you so much. We're inviting our next presenter, Kimberly Cherry, up to the screen now.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kimberly Cherry. Thank you all for being here. I want to start by naming that my first professional love is therapy. I'm a trauma therapist and work mostly with queer and trans people. I'm trained as an MFT in systems and relational therapies, which positions problems within relational and societal structures. Throughout my clinical identity development, both critical consciousness raising and attuned listening to my clients has grown in me an understanding of what therapy can be, how it can be a caring, transformative, and healing space, while also it's contextualized by a field and institutions that perpetuate the harm of dominant culture. As a therapist who is a white, cisgender, queer woman, my own self-work has involved a growing understanding of how my identities, my clients' identities, and socio-political forces inform our relationship and how we co-create meaning in the work of healing. How do I, as a therapist, understand wellness and justice as it shows up in the therapy room? How do I resist dominant culture in that space? Becoming a supervisor more recently, I began to think about my own experiences as a client in therapy and as a therapist in supervision. Being supported and affirmed, as well as what it meant when the space was not supportive or growth-oriented. I became curious about the story of supervision, or the theory of supervision, and about the potential for the space to also be healing and transformative. And I began to think about the importance of supervisors in the role of socializing new therapists into this work. Paulo Freire writes about how dominant culture does not have enough distance from itself to see itself in a critical way, and why Bell Hooks discusses the necessity of placing what is at the margins at the center. This study challenges normative gender constructs and binary categories by rearranging power dynamics and viewing transgender participants as the authority on their experiences. The voices of trans supervisees are almost entirely missing from supervision literature, and when these issues are discussed, it's often with the assumption that transgender and therapist are mutually exclusive binary categories where trans refers to the client and the therapist is assumed to be cisgender. In centering trans therapist voices, I'm learning about supervision and about dominant culture as it shows up in supervision spaces. And also I'm learning about myself. Next slide. I'm drawing from critical feminism, Black feminist thought, queer theory, liberation psychology, using concepts of critical consciousness, intersectionality, historical memory, and the importance of action and social change emphasized in critical research. I interviewed 8 participants who are licensed therapists and who have varying and unique relationships to the identity of transgender. I asked participants to tell the story of their supervision experience, their recommendations to supervisors, and to reflect on their experience of being interviewed. Next slide. I want to focus more on my method of analysis, and you're going to hear more about this in another presentation. The listening guide, developed by Carol Gilligan, is a feminist narrative voice-centered method that integrates literary and music theory to include 3 sequential steps of listening to the meaning-making processes of participants. It prompts her to attend to the terrain of narrative landscapes as well as the layered and evolving voices of participants. And it is also often used, as Gilligan says, to access and understand marginalized and understudied experiences. The first listening is focused on landscape, plot, and themes, and the positioning of the researcher. And one way I capture this in my dissertation is in a chapter devoted to narrative summaries of each participant's story. The second listening involves constructing poems from I statements in a particular piece of the interview, which I'll discuss more on the next slide. And the third listening is for contrapuntal voices, the harmonies, dissonances, and multi-layered meanings within a participant's experience. For example, the voice of connection and the voice of resistance, or the voice of knowing and the voice of not knowing. Next slide. And as I read these poems aloud, you may listen for these layered and changing voices. Here, Henry, in discussing supervisors being interested or curious rather than being critical of them, especially after having so many experiences of transphobia in their life. I had so much exposure that wasn't part of my experience. I think about where I am now. It was enough for me. No, actually, I expect more of you. I need you to be doing. I need you to be showing. I need you to do da-da-da-da-da. I have different expectations now, I guess is what I'm saying. I felt like the bar was really low. I had only known negative experiences. And in the next poem, Olive discusses vicarious trauma in therapy, and throughout her story talks about not having a supervisor who can hold issues of identity with her. I've had to face, I pretty much burned out. I realized I had not been, I had been. I found to inherently include violence. I mean, when I'm working, I have to. I can do that. I'm really, really good at it. I can get. I represent the community. I'm the shining example. I present. I just took on. I can't take anymore. I can't ignore. I'm losing a part of myself. It hurts a lot. In my work as a therapist, supervisor, and now researcher, listening becomes an act of care and resistance, resisting what Freire calls the culture of silence, in which the dominant social structures maintain the silence and oppression of the marginalized, and in turn, the oppressed internalize negative views of themselves and remain silent. These poems in the sequence of the listening guide engage the reader, evoking emotion and response rather than a reporting on approach or searching for certainty in data. These poems capture movement and dialogue inherent in research that privileges relationship in the process of knowing and knowledge creation. Next slide. So I've organized my findings about supervisee experiences in terms of levels: the personal, relational, institutional, and the forces at play, the negative and positive psychological and political forces. It's tough to tease these out as they're not distinct or binary, and they certainly work synergistically. And you can understand some of this in the I poems you've just heard. Through explicit expression, the participants in the study share the experiences of violence, microaggressions, and shame, a focus on intrapsychic processes, and the creation of pathology, especially around gender expression. But also you hear voices of resilience, empathy, connection, community, belonging. Participants discuss cisgenderist practices, intersectional oppression, particularly in this study, cisgenderism, transmisogyny, heterosexism, racism, and anti-Semitism. There are also voices conveying critical consciousness, resistance, advocacy, as well as the experience of more affirming practices within systems. Next slide. I asked participants how the interview was for them, and this is Sky's response. This is a labor of love. This is, I want this research to be done. For people who have been through trauma, which I would consider for my first year placement of trauma, people who have trauma, like, secretly have a secret longing that it wasn't all for nothing, and that, like, their story or their pain can be transformed into something. So, I mean, that was definitely on my mind for this. So how do these experiences transform into something? Like most research, there are implications for further research, and I hope this has an impact on more liberative approaches to supervision and therapy. Perlatinsky and Fox talk about psychopolitical literacy as the ability to understand the relationship between political and psychological forces that enhance or diminish wellness and justice. And so I want to look at this process of how therapists are socialized and what this means. My hope is that this type of critical research fosters psychopolitical literacy as supervisors support new therapists. But also, how has this research affected participants as they tell their stories? And for other trans clinicians, my colleagues, who may read this project and see aspects of themselves represented, or see ways the study is problematic. It has certainly been transforming for me as a therapist, supervisor, and now researcher in my personal liberation journey to hold these kinds of tensions. How does my methodology resist, and how does it perpetuate oppression? One example is, I've said earlier that my participants have unique relationships with the label transgender, and some do not identify as transgender at all. What does it mean to recognize that and resist recategorizing in ways that, as Binohan puts it, are imperialist translations of a variety of genders? So do I even call this study a transgender study? And what does it mean that as I write and discuss findings, my understandings change? That my dissertation will be written and static in form, and yet meaning making will continue to evolve. In this way, psychopolitical literacy truly is a lifelong practice. Even slowing down in the process of preparing this presentation has been meaningful for me to be able to be intentional, to articulate the why of my process, and to be held accountable in a professional, critical community. And hopefully you, in some way, as you hear the words of these participants, hopefully you're interested in the study and want to learn more about what it will say, but also perhaps it prompts questions and ways that you might think about wellness and justice and resistance in your own work and lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kimberly, and that was wonderful. And I'm going to invite our next presenter, Brandon, up to the screen. Brandon, it looks like you are not on screen yet, so I'm going to try this one more time. Stand by. Brilliant. Welcome.
Hi there. I don't know if folks can hear me at all.
Yeah.
You can.
I hear you
it's so
and
funny.
can see you.
I can't hear you, but I can trust that you can hear me. And so I will. Oh, wait. No, can't hear me, actually? No.
Oh.
How about now? Hello? Oh, I can. You can see me. Awesome. Wonderful. All right. Next slide, please. Wonderful. So hi, I am Brandon Jones, and it's my distinct privilege to share a bit about what I've learned in my journey exploring the experiences of Black master's level counselors in predominantly white settings. Before I speak to my learnings, though, I wanted to say a bit about who I am and where I stand. Next slide, please. Great. As a Black cisgender male master's level counselor, having spent most of my career working in predominantly white, non-academic mental health settings, I have been one of 2 or sometimes 3 Black master's level counselors on parts of fairly large clinical teams in each of the community mental health settings where I've worked. I've never once had a Black supervisor or a Black clinical director. I've been mistaken for custodial or security or non-clinical support staff on numerous occasions. And even as, I have sought positions of professional leadership that have been enabled by, going on this doctoral journey, I know, or at least I believe, that in the short term, I am less likely than my white colleagues to be surrounded by folks who look like me or who have a similar background to me. All of this is to say that this work has become very personal for me. Next slide, please. Believe it or not, though, as personal as this work is for me, it started coincidentally. Next slide, sort of, very perfect. That's me right there. And imagine me, I was taking a research course and we were practicing using Boolean operators to affect search results. And I was trying to find literature on Black master's level counselors because they say to, go with what you know. And I was, a part of me at least was hoping that there would be plenty of hits. But another part of me truly was hoping to see myself, to hear my voice reflected in the academic literature. Next click, please. A spoiler, this wasn't my experience. This wasn't the case. Next one, too. And then one more also. Instead of seeing experiences I recognized as similar to my own, I saw distortions of myself and my experiences. If Black counselors were mentioned at all, they almost certainly weren't centered. And even the few studies that had Black counselors centered, the Black counselors were often voiceless. Next slide, please. And so for me, my mission became to center the voices of Black counselors. And I attempted to do so by interviewing 9 Black master's level counselors. I audio recorded and transcribed the interviews of 9 folks who had clinical roles in mental health settings where at least half of their same level peers were white. So in addition to trying to address the gap in the research by trying to find voices, I also viewed my work as a criticism of the structures that created the gap in the first place. Next slide, please. Outlined here is the overview of the listening guide, which I also used in my study. But I want to say a bit more about how I came to use the listening guide. So for me, not only are our data inseparable from the social, cultural, and political and historical context in which they're generated, a critical stance, which I seek to maintain, it obligates researchers to take special care to ensure that their methodological choices illuminate and critique oppressive structures. And so I use the listening guide, which is a voice-centered relational approach. Next slide, please. And as I moved forward, I also integrated strategies from critical qualitative methodology as well. I think that the listening guide and critical qualitative methodology are congruent with the critical stance because they're both characterized by the epistemological assumptions that knowledge is generated relationally through recursive interactions of the researcher, participants, and the broader sociocultural context, and by carefully attending to the interplay of voices within participants and also between them too. As I started listening closely to folks in my interviews with them, I realized that they weren't just talking about intersubjective experiences, what was happening between them and their white colleagues. They were also talking about how they make meaning of these interactions within this broader sociopolitical context too. And since the listening guide doesn't quite specify how to engage in listening specifically, during the first reading, I used meaning field analyses as a way of understanding. So meaning fields are bounded range of possible meanings to generate, and I use them to generate low-level inferences about what participants may have intended to communicate in my attempt at reconstructing their initial senses of meaning with their engagement with their white colleagues in their work settings. And then in the last listening, as part of my journaling, I analyzed participants' meaning fields to identify their various knowledge claims. And since contrapuntal voices, by definition, assume that people make claims about what they think to be true with varying degrees of awareness and directness when they communicate, I thought that this was a helpful, systematic way of stepping through understanding their implicit beliefs that was congruent with the listening guide. And so organically, what started as an endeavor using the listening guide exclusively became a methodological integration, which I hope will offer a meaningful contribution to the field. Next slide, please. And so I found three overarching themes that were captured across participants in their individual experiences. There are problems related to visibility. These were tied to both white supremacy and patriarchy and how their colleagues saw them, often in distorted ways because of white supremacy and patriarchy. Also, there was a common theme that folks wrestled between resisting some of the white supremacist and patriarchal norms that were often imposed upon them, and also sometimes assimilating to them too. And then a third theme, which was exclusively experienced by the female participants in my study, where the white supremacist and patriarchal norms, though all participants experienced them, only female participants found that their work roles were constrained by them. Next slide, please. And so I'm going to run through this really quickly. So this was a triphasic organizational framework that for me highlighted the structural relationship between the intersubjective experiences of participants and the broader context. And so essentially, next click, please. Folks often experience microaggressions. Next click. Then they had to make meaning of these white supremacist and patriarchal experiences. Next click, please. Which gave them some choices. They had to respond after they made meaning. One choice was to be silent, which they feared often would reinforce the white supremacist context and patriarchal context. Next, please. Or they could resist. Next, please. Which often triggered the possibility of engaging with white fragility or with the backlash from the white colleagues as they resisted the expectations that were implicitly being imposed upon them. Next click, please. And so they had to do something with that too. This, of course, was another conflict. Next click, please. And they could either decide to challenge the inherent respectability politics built into white supremacy. Next click, please. or they could choose not to, which sometimes could be reinforcing of the white supremacist and patriarchal status quo. And so in addition to just resisting, though, this also became a movement toward wanting connection. So that was one of the fundamental tensions that emerged, was that it wasn't just about resisting oppressive structures, it was also about genuinely wanting to feel more connected with their colleagues too. Next click, please. And so I have two poems here that capture this tension between resistance and also wanting connection. First, Savannah. I feel really uncomfortable if I don't say anything. I'm co-signing it. If I say something, I risk being seen as the angry Black girl, or I become the Black expert. I'm still pretty new. I have enough to be trying to figure out. I don't want to be stuck like that. And then Vanessa. If I'm being honest, sometimes I pull back. I think about the very best way so that I'm eloquent but non-threatening. If I can just be a bit softer, maybe people will want to be closer to me. I'm tired, low-key, a little sad. I watch them enjoy each other. I can tell they don't feel the same way about me. Hopefully we can talk about more of how this relates to transformative validity in our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And next we'll be inviting on screen Maisha Rodriguez.
You all hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for that, Brandon. So my name is Maisha Rodriguez. As you know, I'm a PhD candidate at Lesley University, and I'm also a licensed mental health clinician. The working title of my dissertation, which hopefully will be coming to a ProQuest near you by the end of this academic year, we'll see, fingers crossed, is Embodied Descriptive Analysis, exploring the impact of systemic oppression on Black public school educators. And before I launch into my content, there are a couple things that I want to leave you with. One of those is that there are three components that contribute to my narrative identity that shape who I am as a leader, scholar, and practitioner. One is social justice. Two is a strong artistic influence and creative expression. And three is holistic sustainability. And so my hope is that as I continue to go throughout my content, you'll see threads of those three components during my time with you today. And the other thing is I want to extend an invitation. So I'd like to invite you all to be open to either visceral or thought responses as you see the different images represented on each of my slides. Next slide, please. So my purpose, an iterative experience. So my aim, my topic was to highlight the experiences and amplify the voices of Black educators in public schools. I was originally considering looking at leaders. There's a lot of research out there on leadership and leaders in general. There's also, in doing my lit review, a lot of content on students, right? And then when I started to narrow down and look at Black educators, there was some content out there on higher education, and there just really seemed to be a gap for Black educators within public schools. So that then led to my research question. How are Black professional and administrative employees' work experiences impacted by direct supervisors in public schools? It's really important for me within that context and exploring that question to be able to also learn more about how the intersection of healthy or unhealthy dynamics impact work sustainability along the health continuum. Also looking at how the system or the institution of education and racial dynamics interplay with supervisor-supervisee relationships. The other thing that I'll name here is I too am a Black educator, right? I'm a Black education administrator. And so I've been in the field as well as the nonprofit sector for a little over 15 years. And I've had my own experiences, right? I've observed those of my colleagues. And so it was really important for me. I became more curious over time, right? Which led to an iterative heuristic inquiry. And from that, you know, I'm highly solutions oriented. And so before I could jump to the solutions, I had to understand more about the dynamic of the construct. And so that also meant that it was really important for me to align with a hermeneutics of faith, right? Where the belief that the truth or the knowledge is within the narrative and the experience as my participants would tell it, share it, and know it. Next slide, please. So my driving force, my epistemology is critical. I had a fun moment with one of my professors when I was still trying to decide between critical and constructivist. And finally, she sat me down. She said, you know, Maisha, there is nothing about your positionality on this topic that is unclear about the institutional inequity and injustice as it relates to Black educators. And I said, you are 100% right. And so from that moment on, I was clearly aligned with a critical epistemology. That then led to me identifying three theories. So there's critical race theory, trauma theory, and organizational theory. Critical race theory, obviously, because in aligning with a broader critical paradigm, and I'm focusing on Black educators, it seemed to be directly aligned for me. And then from that, focusing on both trauma theory and organizational theory. And so it was important for me to not just look at these relationships or these dyads in silo, but to be able to understand the broader historic and socio-political context within which education has developed, right? And thus the experiences of educators. That context including white supremacy culture, that context including inequity as I named. And so then it was important for me to also include trauma theory and being able to acknowledge the historic and intergenerational trauma that Black persons in the United States have experienced, and recognizing that there are experiences within the educational system that trigger, that mirror, that reinforce those very experiences in life writ large. And so that was what, you know, led me to aligning on these three theories, both as my foundation and as the background of my work. Next slide, please. So this is where some of that creative and artistic component comes in for me. And so creative expression meets research methods. I was searching for something that would allow me to really explore from a comprehensive, holistic, and creative lens or perspective my participants' experiences. And so critical qualitative research methods was the main thing that I found that really allowed me to do that and to kind of play, right? And so you can see some of the steps with my methods. The two main things that I want to focus on here are data generation and memoing. And that's the last line. It looks like it's cut off a little bit. But so I chose phenomenological interviewing. And for me, that was incredibly important because I wanted to really be able to, as much as I could experience, and tap into the essence of being as my participant recalled and shared their narrative, right? So for me, in order to do that and generating my data, I did that in a couple ways. Audio recordings with transcripts, video recordings so that I could capture the nonverbal communication, and then images to ground concepts of well-being at work. And so what I did was I had them prepare two images, one that represented their best selves at work and one that represented themselves when they weren't their best at work. It served as both a conversation starter, but it also served as an artistic way to ground where they were on that healthy, unhealthy spectrum, recognizing that things aren't binary when words might not have been as available, right? So it was a tool throughout the interview. The last thing I'll name is memoing. So as I named that I'm a Black educator, Black woman educator. And so for me, in recognizing my own, intersubjective perspective and exploring self-reflexivity, it was really important in aligning with a phenomenological philosophy, less so with bracketing and more so with the stance that names, it is important to recognize and more explicitly call out the connection that you have to your work, the connection that you have to your participants. And so immediately after each interview, I did that, and I was able to explore it from multiple aspects of my narrative identity. Next slide, please. So embodied descriptive analysis, you may be wondering, what is this? You know, who created it? Where can I find it? Well, I created it, so you can find it here, hopefully once my work is published. So embodied descriptive analysis, again, was another element where I was able to kind of tap into that creative part of myself, and really have an approach that would allow me to explore and learn more about the embodiment of my participants' experiences. And so there are 5 steps. The first step is listening to the audio recording and the memo, right? And so this is different than the memoing I did after I conducted the interview. This was a memo that allowed me to just sit with and listen to it, and capture any visceral responses I was having, any connections to theory or themes. And so that was that first step. The second step was coding the transcript, selecting quotes, and synthesizing my coding system. Even in coding my transcript, I still wanted to build these levels of meaning making and kind of understand the experience of my participant. And so I selected low level, from my level 1 codes, a priori coding buckets. And so that's where you have the beliefs, the feelings, the actions. And then there were also components of school culture that I was able to capture, and then interview reflections. And so with the interview reflections, that was what connected to the psychopolitical validity for me. And so participants were naming that they felt as though the experience was restorative and cathartic. They also named either thoughts or actions that they wanted to take as a result of the experience. Step 3 was I poems. I wanted to be able to highlight and amplify the essence of the voice in the interview. Step 4, I reviewed the videos and took observational notes, and all of my coding is in Max QDA. So I overlaid the observational notes with the transcript coding. And then lastly is my horizon analysis. So aligning with Carr Specken's work, you have the meaning making throughout in each of these steps. And then the horizon analysis really allowed me to explore validity claims along with power analysis to really gauge what is foregrounded and what is backgrounded here, you know, along all of those components. Next slide, please. And so lastly, the images that you all have seen, these were all images that my participants used to represent their best selves at work and when they're not their best selves at work. I know I definitely had a visceral response seeing them for the first time, and hopefully the invitation to check in with yourselves, either viscerally or thoughts that were coming up for you as you were seeing the images. And so with that, I will say thank you for your time, and I look forward to sharing more of my work in the future.
Thank you very much. And here comes our last presenter, Carla Rosinski. Welcome.
Hi. I'm sorry, I missed the very last thing that Maisha said, so I wasn't ready to be pulled up. But so hello, and I'm just pretty honored right now to go after all these presentations. So I'm really excited about what my colleagues have talked about. And like the rest of us, my research is both personal and professional. I am a white cisgender LMHC and certified sex therapist. I began the trajectory of this research when I came out as queer in high school during the early 90s, and also became involved in HIV education and activism in the queer communities. I was introduced to liberation theology and psychology in undergrad and began the lifelong exploration of my own positions of power, privilege, and oppression. And my first paid job was in reproductive justice and sex education. And so I brought those experiences with me into my pursuit of clinical training in my master's program. And cis heteronormativity has always been something that I've really struggled with and against in my life. And As a clinician for the past 10 years in private practice, I've been primarily serving the queer, trans, and non-binary communities. And I also see the way that cis heteronorms impact white cisgender heterosexual communities specifically, because in general, it seems that there is a less of awareness of the complexity of some of these systems. Next slide, please. So a little bit of framing. Sexuality is part of overall well-being. Sexuality is fundamental to human experience, and that includes a whole galaxy of identities and experiences, from asexual, it's not a spectrum, it's a galaxy, as Shanna Katari says. But it's not just about our relationship to any act of sex. It's about our relationship to our bodies, our experiences of pleasure and joy, our connections with ourselves and others. And dominant cultural norms in the United States do not support or promote healthy relationships with sex, gender, and sexuality. In fact, it's often quite toxic and confusing. And so our sex education is lacking, to say the least. I believe the current statistic is that only 13 states, well, first of all, I think it's only 24 states that require any type of sex education, but the 13 of those states require that information to be medically accurate. And so that means that if you did receive any sex ed growing up that was formal sex ed in school, the information could be questionable. And often the dominant cultural norms or the media become the sex educator. And so therapists grow up in this sex negative culture as well, and they're not met with human sexuality training in graduate programs as a requirement. Often it's a elective that one has to choose. And it's often not something that people can have time for in their curriculums. Next slide, please. Which is concerning in a lot of ways because sexuality is a site of oppression. There's the dominant cultural understanding of gender and sexuality has historical ties to colonization and capitalism that impact us all today and disproportionately impact marginalized communities. Cis heteronormativity describes a set of societal assumptions and norms which are based on heterosexual cisgender experiences, influenced by social bias, privilege, and stereotyping. And therefore, cis heteronormativity is not simply the privilege of being heterosexual or cisgender, but it's a ubiquitous force in which heteronorms are linked to social oppression. And while the social oppression is embedded in cultural messages, socialization, and institutional policies, it's also enforced and perpetuated through social policing enacted at an individual level. And none of this is new. Black women have been writing about this, talking about this for centuries. Trans and queer folks have been writing about this for decades. Next slide, please. But the fields of gender and sexuality are really rich and multidisciplinary, and psychology just doesn't seem to have really caught up. Nor has psychology really been accountable for its role in oppression around gender and sexuality and pathologizing of gender and sexuality. And so my research question is really, how do we replicate or challenge cis heteronormativity in discourse? My theoretical orientation, I'm influenced by Black feminist thought, queer theory, liberation psychology, critical sexuality studies. And I decided to use podcasts as my data source for using critical discourse analysis, which I'll talk about in a moment. But by using podcasts, what I did was I did searches for things like sex education, sex advice, or relationship advice to see what top podcasts came up. And I just spent a lot of time doing that actually to see what was sort of repetitive, what sort of came up a lot, and then chose episodes that were at the top of the list of those for popularity. I then filled in some gaps because a lot of those podcasts that came up were not focused on disability, were not focused on queer audiences, were not focused, they didn't have Black hosts. A lot of them were white, cisgender, heterosexual hosts. And so I filled in the gaps with some other popular podcasts that didn't necessarily show up in the initial searches, and spent a lot of time listening to the entirety of the data, what was there, doing a little bit of also some background on the data. What was the goal of these podcasts? Who's the host? What's the positionality? And then within the data, looking for sort of using the critical sexualities framework, which is looking for, is there conceptual analysis? Is there ongoing discussion about what is being talked about? Or are there assumptions about a word being used and what that definition means? Is there attention to abject bodies? These are bodies that are, you know, historically considered like out of bounds. These are generally bodies like bodies that have illness, bodies that are different sizes, queer bodies, trans bodies, disabled bodies. And then the third piece of it is an ongoing challenge of heterosexual privilege. Next slide, please. So critical discourse analysis looks at, okay, well, let me take my thought for a sec. I use this image here because I figured that I would have a hard time describing what critical discourse analysis is, mainly because I'm really in the weeds with my data and my findings right now. And so looking at this image of the parking icon, we can see the image on the left is the traditional icon that we see that's very stable and stagnant. And then you can see this new icon, which is the accessible icon project, which you may have noticed is starting to take over your parking lots and your different signs, like people are starting to adopt this. Part of that is around what this image communicates, right? So the old image is really, there's no movement, there's no agency, and the new image is showing that yes, with people with disabilities, people that use wheelchairs are active, are moving forward. There's a pretty substantial difference in these images. And so part of critical discourse analysis is really naming the assumptions, naming what's going on, making the implicit explicit, what's happening in the foreground, what's happening in the background, and like where are there moments of resistance and liberatory action. So next slide, please. So I thought I would use a brief example from one of the podcasts that, a simple example that could be maybe to show us today. There were so many rich examples, but this is a brief quote from the podcast. It's titled Bad Girls Bible. The tagline of the podcast is Have Better Sex Tonight. And this is from episode 31, where the host, who's a cisgender male, is interviewing a cisgender therapist who I believe is a sex therapist. The quote, as you can see, well, I'll read it. So the therapist says, only 15% of women climax through sexual intercourse, only 15%. And women come to me all the time and they say, I'm dysfunctional, I'm not climaxing through intercourse. And it's like, no, you're not dysfunctional. And then the host says, well, it could be your man. And so there's a lot here, even though it's a short quote. Like, who is this therapist talking about? And I realize I'm only giving you this line, but the reality is that even within the 45 minutes of this, I'm not sure who she's talking about. There's no conceptual analysis giving or naming of any audience, except for those who want to have better sex tonight. And so when there's no framing, when there's no naming, what that means is that we're centering cisgendered, heterosexual folks, married couples specifically, how to fix a sexless marriage, married being sort of placing monogamy as, centering monogamy as the ideal and as the only option. There's no discussion or analysis around what is sexual intercourse or any sort of structural critique around why only 15% of women might climax. Who are women? Who are their relationships? What kind of sex is this? What is this sex? But I want to actually focus on what the host says, because while it sounds like he might be trying to subvert the power by taking shame off of women and placing blame on the man, what he's unintentionally doing, I think unintentionally doing, is reinforcing the male ownership of female pleasure, which is a dominant cultural narrative. And there's some possibility here that there's assumptions also that a cisgender heterosexual man should have more sexual experience. And so there's some shaming there of cisgender heterosexual men, which is really using dominant cultural narratives. Yeah, not in a great way. Next slide. Oh, I think I'm done with time. So I'll just real briefly say, so that we have time for questions and answers, is this is another quote from Queer Sex Ed, where their tagline is "Pleasure is a basic human right," and so if you see something that's about racism and you're a white person and you go, what does this have to do? What does race have to do with this? I want you to take a minute and reframe that question and say, What about this am I not understanding? How can I learn more about how race infuses this topic? Because the reality is that it infuses almost everything. And so if you're missing something, if you feel like something isn't about race, class, disability, or whatever, you're missing something. It's not that the thing isn't there. It's that you and your privileged understanding of the world might be lacking a wider understanding. And so this is an example of actually subverting power and subverting the power around the labor and accountability of who's to be explaining what to who. And it's also identifying the deficit of knowledge and the privileged understanding. So yeah, there's a lot of analysis that can be done here, and obviously I'm out of time, but that's just a small taste of where I'm at in the weeds with my research. So thank you so much. I think we're all going to come on screen now to take any questions, and so I'll wait for folks to pop up. So does anyone, well, I don't see Serena yet. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to share? It looks like the questions in the Ask a Question box are already taken care of, meaning how long will the session run and are the questions at the end. So yes, the questions will be at the end of the presentation. All right, well, you guys did fabulous. Thank you for putting together your presentations, even though I know how much we're all really still in it and managing a million things.
Looks like we've got a couple of questions coming in.
Oh.
Thanks, Sue.
The first question is, you talked about critical friend group. How has the group facilitated your research process? Would anyone like to take that?
I know for me, being a part of the critical friends group was it helped me to also be accountable to my participants, because it's been a space where I can talk about any of the ways in which that I would get stuck, you know, with understanding how power is functioning in this context. And so whether it's, you know, my participants struggling with an application process or some system, navigating some kind of system, it was, and I'm in my head, I'm kind of like stuck and not seeing the power issue. And then if I'm being able to just kind of talk about it, or it being brought up even, I think I remember recently Kim and I had a conversation about waiting. One of the things that my participants named often was waiting that they had experienced. And I kind of was like, I don't think that that's a huge theme. But after just being able to talk about it with Kim and being challenged on it, and like, you know, seeing it a different way, in a different perspective, I was able to look at that differently and define it as see the systemic issues in just the waiting process. When you're waiting for housing. So for me, it's been, and that happens, that's not only in my research process, I would say, I know the questions about research, but it's been in like our personal lives, just during this pandemic and during the transitions that we navigated in our personal lives as well, in our professional lives. The critical friends group has been really helpful, because I think as a person of color, sometimes it's assumed that we see power all the time. We see the power but we don't. Sometimes you can just overlook it because it's just, that's your experience. So this group has been really helpful to point out things that might be a blind spot.
Yeah, I think the thing that really resonates with me that Serena named was like the challenge piece. And so I feel like this critical friends group, in addition to us like just truly being friends, is it enabled us to move beyond just theoretical conversation, and to really make praxis live and breathe, and to be able to hold each other accountable, right, in terms of our growth and understanding our work, and you know, our growth as practitioners and scholars and leaders and in the work. And so you know, we've been able to be there for the beauty, right, and we've been able to be there through the pain. And I think what's allowed us to do that is trust that we all have for each other, and being able to come forward. We all have areas of privilege and non-privilege, right? And be vulnerable and say, hey, you know, I don't get this. Can you help me understand it more? Or, hey, that was a miss. Can we talk about that?
Yeah.
We have a few more questions coming in. We have a couple questions about iPoems. I'd like to hear more about the use of iPoems and how they help in analysis overall. And the other question, not about iPoems, but about poems. Maisha, are the poems that are constructed in the research done with the participants during the experience, or are they constructed from the interviews done?
That was for me?
Yes.
Oh, so I pulled from the transcripts, and that was how I constructed the iPoem. I also chose, because there are a couple of different approaches, so you can like select like a section of the transcript, or you can look at the entirety of the transcript to kind of get flow of voice and experience. And so that's what I chose to do. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah. Does anybody else want to say anything about iPhone? So then another question is from Fred Wirtz. If you were able to introduce something from your work into the research methods section of the first chapter of standard introductory textbooks, what would it be? I mean, something about white supremacy culture. We have to be calling it out more. We have to be naming it, and we have to be talking about it, and not just in the really obvious ways, but especially in the really subtle ways that it can show up. And so I would say, absolutely, something along those lines.
I was gonna say critical reflexivity, and like, because I feel like as I've grown in my understanding through graduate school experiences, like I think earlier on it was like, who are you? You know, when I read research, it's like, who are you, and what, like how are you making these claims, and like it's like it almost felt like there wasn't a person behind the research, and so I think that's such a critical part of it, to name assumptions. Who are you as you present this information, and how did you arrive at that? What are your assumptions? That seems really important for introductory work, I think.
I would say too, on my end, I think this is something I keep referring to, but just this notion that, you know, research is happening with, you know, in the context of relationships. So the information that we're gathering from people is that experience that happened in the context of a relationship. And so I think the research process should also be happening in the context of a relationship at every stage, and I feel like that should be emphasized more, where for me, collaboration and you know, for these critical theories and frameworks, relationship is really highlighted, but I don't think it's always highlighted and emphasized in the research methods. That it's often like you just hear these narratives of the research is really isolating, and but I think that could go in introductory document.
I'd also add, and it kind of connects to I think what Kim said a little bit, but like power and meaning making. I think for me, that's been a really transformative experience to begin exploring, you know, where power comes from and what dominant power is and how that's shaped knowledge, right? And how we understand what's right and quote unquote wrong. And so just being able to kind of tell some of those notions up front, I think would be really powerful.
And that Maisha was reminding me of a thought I was just having, because thinking about naming how, you know, some research, like historically, how research doesn't tend to power and what that can do. And so, you know, I don't know what exact textbook we're looking at, but we all know that there's a lot of textbooks that are citing things that we don't really know what that research was tending to and what it was reproducing. And so that's, yeah.
Really good point.
So we have another question from Katrina. I noticed that all of the data analysis were using existing theories, which of course validated those theories. Does this research paradigm ever endeavor to be neutral in approaching the substantive area of investigation, especially if there is a desire to identify neglected areas of consideration that emerge from the data when no concepts are preconceived and imposed into the data? Let's see. I have to take that in a second. I already have a thought, though, if anybody else wants to go first.
Can folks hear me?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Sorry before about my technical difficulty. I don't have a clear answer, but a question or maybe an observation comes up, and that's around what it means to be neutral. And since I'm not sure that there's ever a circumstance when research happens without context, whether that's social, cultural, political, historical, I think that there always has to be some kind of level of analysis that includes how power impacts how research unfolds. And so I probably want to know more about what's meant by neutrality for myself.
And I was thinking about queer theory and a lot of critical theories that they don't, you know, one of the things that can be difficult about them is that they don't give you blueprints. They don't give you, you know, if we're trying to break down binaries or we're trying to break down boxes, then you're going to have theories that have a lot of ability to be evolving and moving. And so in that way, when I read that question, I thought, oh, well, I didn't feel the need. I didn't feel boxed in because the theories that I am influenced by are theories that are expansive and opening, and as opposed to having a short definition and boxing in. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, I think to Carla's point, part of what in looking at the question, desired to identify neglected areas. And so where that kind of led me was because there is, oftentimes I think in acknowledging context, there is sometimes can be a binary understanding that doesn't mean that there still can't be fluidity, flexibility, and openness to what you may discover. And so for me, even though I had a very clear epistemology and theories that were shaping my work, I still was able to go in completely open, right? So one of my first participants, she had no negative experiences that she could really recount. And that was new. And in some ways I was open to it, didn't expect it, but it was her reality. And so I think that having a critical stance doesn't necessarily mean that it's binary and that there's not room to explore the unknown.
It looks like Katrina's following up and saying, as neutral as possible, intentionally bracketing if you want to use a phenomenological term. And I would say that with bracketing or with anything, you know, being able to name the thing, being able to identify your position doesn't make your position go away. But if you can't name it, then it's probably showing up in ways that you're not aware of. And so, again, I don't believe that that any research can be neutral. And I think that if not naming it, then it's showing up in ways that the researcher can't account for. But I'm a candidate. I'm not yet a doctor.
You're also a criticalist, right? So
very true.
I think there's one left. Loved all your presentations. You illustrated that methodology is a verb and a generative and creative process. Can some of you talk a bit more about the methodologizing process for your project? How do your methodologies or methods evolve in time? How is yourself reflected in the process? I mean, I think a lot of you said really well how some of the stuff is really reflected. I don't know if you have more. I mean, there's always more to say, I'm sure. I think sometimes it's hard to separate when we're the stage that I'm in writing and being overwhelmed with 100 pages of chaos of findings that I've typed up is you know, it does. I know I trust my process that as I reflect and as I read and as I write and as I talk with my friends and my colleagues and my committee that that it will start to form a little bit better, that I will start to sort of see how it can be organized in a way that flows better, or start to see things that are emerging from it. So I think, I don't know if that answers the question, but I try to just trust that when you're in the weeds, eventually you find a little bit of a way out.
I think for me, it's been, you know, doing research with a population that I work with all the time has been, and having to have it fit in the academy or, you know, in academia has been a challenge for me, because a lot of times I feel, and that's the reflective piece that's also like then then influence my methodology. Because a lot of times I feel that it's not always authentic. I'm not showing up as my authentic self. And so I think I've actually had some of these conversations with you, Pei, but how do I still follow the rules of academia, but also still be really accountable to my participants at the same time. So it's really important. So, and yeah, I think that's how myself is reflected. What can I do to make sure that the methodologies are as authentic to me and to my process and to my participants that I know really, you know, well, because I've worked with them for so long, and not, but also how to, you know, making that fit into APA.
I agree. Perhaps on a practical level, I would say that I didn't start, so during my proposal, I initially planned on analyzing the data using the listening guide exclusively. And then as I was going along, I added meaning field analyses and validity horizon analyses. And that was sort of because it emerged as I was, you know, neck deep in the analysis phase. And so that was an example of how it was clear to me that I was missing a structural power critique that I thought the critical qualitative research methods could add in a more clear and intentional way for me.
So I see Katrina following up. How do you produce genuinely new knowledge if you cannot be as neutral as possible in research? And I think I'd like to start, I would just like put it back to say like, what's the assumption that there's not knowledge? What's the assumption that of the knowledge, right? Where's the assumption? What's the assumption that we can create new knowledge? What's the assumption that there's not, knowledge that we're tapping into already that's already existing? So I think I would actually want to analyze power in this question and see sort of what the position around that is. Does that make sense?
And I think also, Carla, there's a very kind of logistic element there where I think, we all still have a little triggered from, we're not removed enough from it, but doing our lit reviews, I think there's an extensive review of the research where we could identify possible gaps. I know for me, that's how I landed on my very specific focus. So that was also something that helped the ground perspective.
Right, absolutely. Lit review is so far in my head right now, but you're absolutely right. Right, we're
blocking it out.
I wonder, how does one, so for me, right, I looked at, structurally speaking, white supremacy and patriarchy, and I wonder what it would mean to investigate that from a position of neutrality. Mm-hmm. I have a hard time conceptualizing it. Now, if neutrality is to mean sort of going into the exploration open to learning, to having preconceived ideas challenge, then certainly, for sure, I agree. But for me, I went in knowing and believing, well, white supremacy exists, so does patriarchy, and it does things in knowable ways, right? And so for me, that's why I view my epistemological stance as not constructivist, if that makes sense. But I see the tension between going into an endeavor with an idea about what you'll find and why that's problematic. Mm-hmm. And also, I think it's important to be honest about the things that are already known that exist and not pretend they don't exist, for me.
Right. Right. I think one of the things that we're all sharing in common is documenting knowledge that has always existed and has been not valued, not centered, not has been in the margins, right? Has been in the margins versus being valued as knowledge. And so yeah.
And I think also this piece that, Sarah brought up around how are you defining knowledge, and, being able to look at that from understanding states of being versus states of knowing, and seeing that as somewhat of a Venn diagram where it's not completely mutually exclusive, but there is an interactive relationship between both of those components. And so for us, I would say that, coming back to that piece that was named earlier around power and meaning making, right? And understanding who is defining terms that we're familiar with, right? Who is defining what is influential historically versus not. And so for us, that was a context that we felt was important to name and be explicit about naming, as our findings are contributing to a body of work where there seems to be a current gap.
And we are 5 minutes over, but that's not bad. Thank you for all the questions, and thank you for everyone for.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much for being here and for contributing your wisdom and insight and experiences and perspectives of all kinds. This has been a really wonderful event, and I've loved the conversations happening in the chat and between all of us too. So thank you so much.
And certainly, my email address is bjones6@leslie.edu, and I'd love to keep on with the conversation if you'd like to. Particularly, yeah, it feels unfinished to me.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to honor that.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Brandon.
Yeah.
And I also want to say there is the next event that's coming up would be a place where we certainly could continue to take up some of these questions. It's going to be on October 23rd. This will be an afternoon one. It's from 12 to 1:30. And the title is Reclaiming Generalization in Qualitative Research: How, Why, and to What? So that'll feature Heidi Levitt along with Tone Roald and Joseph Maxwell. And I think that'll be a cool and interesting space to, again, take up some of these questions about knowledge and generalization of knowledge and some kind of cool epistemological stuff. So thank you so much, and I hope to see you there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, take care.
Bye.